it is suggested that the courts may understand unconscionability to require a higher degree of unfairness than if the pure term unfairness had been used. And in the literature is also reference to the case Shumkit-Ching, which is said to focus too much on the bargaining process and too little on the issue of substantive fairness. Be it as it may, I mention this just because in the same paper, a suggestion about Lee Mason, a suggestion was made concerning law reform that the Hong Kong legislator should adopt new rules based on the UK unfair terms in consumer contracts regulations from 1999, as is suggested that this legislation would more effectively protect consumers as the present rules. And there's already a body of UK case law to support the application of these rules. And I start from this assumption that we have a proposal that Hong Kong should look more closely into the UK unfair terms in consumer contracts regulations. And note that this legislation is not a UK invention, which you probably all know, or most of you know, but I say it for those who don't yet. Now you all know. It's a UK legislation introduced to fulfill the obligation of the United Kingdom to implement European legislation in the area, namely the Unfair Contract Terms Directive, which I mentioned in the beginning. So, to understand the meaning of the UK rules, one has to look at their European origin. And one also has to understand that the UK, in principle, is not free in the interpretation of the regulations. It has to take into account the practice of the European Court of Justice, and there's quite a body of case law concerning the Unfair Contract Terms Directive from this court, stemming in particular from later years. In this way, I think the Hong Kong discussion could be directly linked both to the UK and the European development. Before continuing, I should mention that the UK Unfair Terms in Consumer Contracts Regulations, which was referred to in the article, has now precisely these days been replaced by new legislation in the UK. The new law has come into force the 1st of October 2015, the Consumer Rights Act 2015. Part 2 of that act contains the same provisions that were previously in the Unfair Terms in Consumer Contracts regulations. But it contains some smaller changes, but the basic rules which I am discussing here have remained the same in the new act, as you can see here on that slide. But I won't, these minor details, I won't bother you with them. Then I will look at the main rules. Well, turning now to the European rules, which is kind of a basis for this UK legislation, on which the regulations and the Consumer Rights Act are based. These rules, as I said, are contained in the directive from 1993, which every member state of the European Union is obliged to implement in its national legislation. And in order to understand the directive, we have to take one step further backwards. Now gone from Hong Kong to the UK, to the European, to Brussels, and now from Brussels back to the member states. The process of drafting the directive was, namely, not an easy one. The starting points of the member states were very different, both within the European Union as well as in more broad international perspective. One can distinguish 4 different approaches to unfair contracts regulations. We had different referees in different countries. The yellow card was presented in different ways in the different countries.